We're live.
Are we live?
All right. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Adrian. I'm a senior software engineer at G2I. Some of you may know me, but for those of who don't, I've been working at G2I for about 5 years now. I specialize in React and React Native, and I've been working on the G2I internal team for the last year and a half. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. His name is Gabe. Gabe has 10 plus years of experience as an app architect and full stack engineer. So today, Gabe will be talking to us about a new way to use classes in React. He's been building a library called Expressive MVC, which is a new way of managing everything in React. I won't say any more and let Gabe take the floor. Welcome, Gabe.
Hi. So
So,
yes, as Adrian introduced me, my name is Gabe. I, by profession, am a app architect. And basically what that means is that I will not only develop apps, but I'll essentially scope them out, set up what we're using, how we're using it, and be able to figure out the infrastructure of the team and the stack that we're using when we build something. So this library is essentially an attempt to make things like that easier. And so this is what I'm going to be showing you today.
cool. So Gabe, maybe we can start off with what is Expressive MVC?
Okay, so we all have some form of state library that we use in React. So some people use, just simple things like React Query and Formic for specific applications. And then some people use Redux and MobX and all sorts of, really advanced setups for, larger apps that need to scale and be interactive and super fancy. And so Expressive MVC is just an attempt to simplify the process of managing your own state where you don't have to go as low level as hooks because there are a lot of teams that they've sworn off every state library imaginable. They just essentially use only hooks and that's it. But then they're kind of like responsible for all the complexity of hooks, making sure that they're optimized, that they read well, and that they're efficient, right? On the other hand, you've got people who delegate their entire state machine to things like, XState and Redux and just all sorts of things, right? And then there's kind of people in the middle where I did mention, React Query is a really good example of this, where, you need to make an app and you need it to be responsive. It needs to do things like fetch data or respond to events and display information and cache that information. And so you end up installing a whole ton of libraries to accomplish relatively basic things that React doesn't really give you out of the box. And so I basically made MVC as this way for you to define how you want your state to work. It's not really opinionated in the sense that it's saying, here is how your state must work in order to function properly. It's very open-ended. And long story short, the concept is this. You define a class and you put in whatever you want into that class, and then it becomes stateful, kind of like a reducer, if you know what that is. And whenever anything changes in that class, the instance that you used in a particular component will cause it to refresh. And so it's like really straightforward. And so beyond that, it will also work with context to make your experience like way easier. And you'll see that as we go forward through this talk.
Cool. Maybe we'll start with another question. What was your motivation for building Expressive MVC?
Well, personally, it's just because I find hooks really overcomplicated. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, hooks are awesome. They're super simple to use on an individual level, right? That it's, you make your component, you make them as function components. And so they're really straightforward. Like, you know exactly what you're making, you know exactly what it looks like and how it responds to data. So they're kind of like dumb, right? But I think that when hooks were first introduced in React 16.8, it wasn't the hooks that were the main star. They were just kind of facilitating what made React much better at that time. Because, like for those who have been using React for, longer than say 4 years or 5 years, there was a time before hooks even existed, pre 16.8, where you needed to define everything in classes, right? So like if you had any sort of stateful component, you made this little class and then you said extends React component, and then you defined the render in there, and then you had set state, and it was just like this big complicated mess, right? And then so when 16.8 was released and we finally got hooks, what was really exciting about that was the fact that instead of function components, which at the time were called stateless components, instead of them just being dumb, where they didn't do anything and they weren't capable of anything, hooks made them essentially the main thing that you could use. And that was what was really exciting. But with the hooks, while they're great in a vacuum, they scale really poorly, and so when that first dropped, that was one of the first observations I had with that. And so Expressive MVC has been something I've been working on literally since then, and kind of finally got it to a place I'm super happy with it and wanted to share. So this is kind of my attempt to kind of get it out there, get feedback from the community, and make that work.
Cool. And as a related question, so what are some of the things that bother you about the existing libraries today?
Well, one, they're heavy. So they add a lot of bloat to your app. And as somebody who, as an architect, I'm always dealing with CI, installation, all sorts of stuff. You really see how much these libraries add up. Because if you're using React Query, Formic, Redux, and then any number of these open source, state things that manage, like toasts and routing, you just end up with a ton of stuff in your app, and not for a lot of gain, you know what I mean? Because it's when you download these massive libraries, you're only like using 1 or 2 features unless you're a total power user, and it makes starting up really hard. And then so beyond that, the other thing that I didn't really like, and I'll show it through a series of screenshots. So this is a screenshot from work, don't tell anybody, but basically this is a component, right, in some admin dash. And you will see that it is just littered with all sorts of hooks and callbacks and logic, and this is all inside of your components. So in a function that was supposed to be specifically for styling and layout, ends up to be this mishmash of behaviors and closures and stuff, and it's just impossible to debug. And I see this over and over and over again in my work as I go from team to team and try to help them make their stuff more efficient. It's like you have to go through 200 lines in any particular component before you get to actual JSX. And that just grinds my gears. And so the one takeaway that I want from this library is that you can take all of your logic and all of your state and stuff it into classes of which are in TypeScript, they're type safe, they have IntelliSense, and they make sense. So we're going to go into a small example that just gives you the gist. So we're finally going to scroll down from this page. So first you install it. It's really simple. You have something called a model. And this is basically a class of which you are responsible for extending when you want to do something. You create it, you fill it with values, methods, all sorts of stuff that matters to you, and you use it. So here's a super basic example. So step 1, you create your model. And so you import model from Expressive React. So this is the React binding of it. I hope to support more front-end libraries in the future, but React is what I've really tiered onto to make it excellent. And so we're going to create a class called counter. It extends model. It contains 1 value. It's just current, right? And so you can increment it by just saying this.current++ and decrement it likewise. And then you use it in your components. So the way you do that is with one of 2 methods. I'm going to show you the first one called use. And as you could imagine, Just like use state, use reducer, whatever, I'm using counter. And so what this ends up doing is it creates an instance of counter, and then that's going to be used memoed into this component. So it's going to be maintained. But what's really nice about this is that I'm going to destructure current, right? Now that instance started with the value 1. And I also have increment and decrement. So we're going to hop over to this example in Code Sandbox and just see it in action. So over here, we have the same example, and we're going to just use it. So if I go down, it decreases. If I click up, it increases. And basically what's happening is that this object right here is aware of what you used when this first rendered. So anytime anything in this instance changes, no matter how you do it, when you do it, from where you do it, it's going to update this component. And that's really clean, right? Because you already have IntelliSense. It's not like use state where I have to define exactly what I'm using and then create a separate callback for it. I just say, here are my values. I don't care where they're defined. They're just going to sit nicely in this class, and they're going to affect what I want. And so let's go back to the docs. So there's a number of things that you can do that makes this really useful. For one, you can do as many values as you want. So instead of like const A set A use state, const B set B use state, const C set C use state, instead of confusing yourself to death over that, you can just create one model, put as many values as you want, and they're all tracked. So in this situation, if I create state and I use it and I access foo and bar here, if foo changes, becomes 2, it'll refresh. If bar changes, it'll refresh. But you notice I didn't use baz here. And that's kind of an important factor. This is not going to just up and refresh anytime anything changes. It's only going to refresh when the things you used in your component change. And this makes your state really portable without you having to be worried about just constant events that are acting like reducers that need to be checked back and forth to make sure that they're not creating unnecessary stuff. And what that leads to is like really simple interactions, because you can essentially just edit stuff. So in this case, we have 3 ways that we're editing. And I want to point out this line. We have is, which is one of the only built-in properties of model. And it is essentially a loopback. So you see how we destructured this? We would want the full instance in order to edit values. So we have is, and then we just call it state. So instead of const state equals, we use const destructure is state, and then we have the ability to destructure the things we actually want. And this is necessary because destructuring is essentially a convenient way to say, here are all the things that I am using. And then this is going to trigger the necessary getters in JavaScript that actually allow this to track and to update on demand. So in this case, we have a use effect right here, which is going to set an interval, and it's basically just going to increment baz over and over and over again every second, and then clear itself out when done. And then we can also click on foo to increase it, in which we're just doing state.foo equals plus plus. And then finally, we have another example, which is just kind of our control group, where we're saying on click bar plus 1, and then that's going to increment it by essentially just calling this function, in which instead of saying state.bar, it's saying this.bar. So it's basically showing you can make these modifications from literally anywhere. And so we're going to go and show you that working. This is a slightly different example, but it kind of gets the point across, is that we can get pretty fancy stuff basically for free, where our component itself is nice and clean, but all of our logic is fairly complicated. So in this case, we have a timer, right? And we're going to use one of the other built-in methods, just on. And basically think of this as like a use effect, and it works almost the exact same way, where it calls this particular function. In this case, we've created a method over here, which is going to do what we did before with the timer, where we're going to create an increment, call back, we're going to set an interval, and then clear the interval when the controller dies. And then so we have one value. We have seconds, which starts at 0. So if we refresh this, it's just going to be zeroed out, right? And then we have several getters here. And all these getters are doing is formatting the code as we want to see it. So if I want to see minutes, I just divide seconds by 60 and floor it, right? Same with hours, same with format. And what's nice is that at the end of the day, when we're building out our component, we get IntelliSense that shows us exactly what we want to see. So we have seconds. I'm not sure why this is not loading very fast, but we get minutes, we get autocomplete for hours, and we get it for format. And then so when we're building our component, it's just so clean. It's just, here's what we're using, and here's where I want it to be. And then you can put your styles, your conditionals in there, and it just looks good, and it's not complicated. And more importantly, it's portable, which is like the most important factor. So anyway, let's go back over to our docs and continue. So where this really gets fancy, I must say, is with async. So here we have an example where we've created a model. Now, we've all been there. We wanted to create a query, and so we have to install a giant library to make that work, right? Because we have to track, response. We have to do the weighting. We have to get the error handling. And it's just nasty code. So why not put it into a model and then just use an async function to manage it? So here in our component, it's pretty contrived, I would say, but it really helps to get the point across. We have this component. This is it. There's nothing waiting in the wings helping this process along. It's just, I'm going to pull error, response, waiting, and say hello from a instance of greetings that I've created, so that when I have a response, it'll show the response. If I have an error, it'll show the error. If I'm waiting, it'll wait on the response. And finally, if I'm doing nothing, it'll ask you to say hello. So let's go try that out. So we're going to go over to our fetch example, and we have that right here where, as I just showed you, we have a button that's displayed when we're doing nothing. And I'm going to click on it, and it's going to say waiting on response. It's doing a fetch request, and then that fetch requests come back, and then we get hello, Fernando Ortiz, which is basically just from some random user API, right? And all that I needed to do was just create an async function. And here we are just doing a try block and a catch block and just setting values. So, this response is undefined. So if that's undefined, it's just going to go over here to error. Error is undefined. Okay, move on. If waiting is not defined, move on. And so as a result, we click on our button, we get what we need, and it's really not that complicated. If I were to throw something, I said, oops. We go ahead and save that. When our thing fails, it says there was an issue saying hello, simply because we caught it and set that error to true. So this should kind of show you that it's not necessarily doing things for you. It's allowing you to do things for yourself, where you might choose to do this by hand instead of use React Query if it was all you needed, right? And so it just makes things a little more straightforward ultimately, which is why I made this. I don't want to have to use a ton of libraries in order to get basic things done. It's really that simple. All right, so we're going to keep going. Another thing that is really nice about this is because they're classes, you get all the benefits of classes. So you can extend them. And that's really nice because let's say that I wanted to create some special logic that my organization reuses all the time. I want to make a custom form. I want to make a custom modal. I want to make a custom interface. I can essentially make that, and it will work super seamlessly by just extending the reusable logic. And that way I can make my code super dry and efficient, and it doesn't need to be complicated at all. And so I'll show you an example of that. Another thing that we are able to do, which is kind of related to this, is essentially integrating props. Because, at the end of the day, you don't want your model to just be a closed system. You want it to be able to interact with other things. So here we've created an example where we've created something of a simplified query. Again, there's nothing special about this. Everything you see is what you get. And so what we have right here is 3 items: the actual application, we have this class controller, and we have the example component. And in this example component, we're creating an instance of greetings. which uses props. So instead of just use with nothing, we're going to pipe props in there. And what this is going to do is it's going to take everything in this object props, and it's going to merge it into the object itself. So we defined name, John, and we defined birthday. In this case, let me set it to a different date to show you kind of what's going on. So I'm going to set it to Jan 1. So you'll see that it said, hi, John, happy unbirthday all of a sudden. And then finally, if I actually change it to Bob, it'll change it to Bob. So what's actually going on here? Well, this component doesn't care about name and birthday. It cares about first name and is birthday. That's the only values that it's using. And so it renders that accordingly. If it is your birthday, that's just a Boolean. It's going to say happy birthday and happy unbirthday otherwise. And so really what the model is doing is it's saying, I'm going to create an instance of greetings, and then I'm going to insert name and birthday into these values. Then as I access those values, I'm going to actually do something specific to them and then use them in my component. So again, we have data sanitization through the component rather than relying on the actual component to do the work to make sure that the data is sanitized, combined, or anything of that nature, which is really nice. So moving on from that, if I can just get my sidebar here. I'm still trying to learn Arc. It's a really nice browser. I suggest it, but it's a learning curve. So in any event, we are going to move on to a little more of a fancy async example where we have a really high stakes mission. Agent Bond, we need you to defuse the bomb. If you can't do it in a set number of seconds, your cat's gonna die. Or maybe not, but still. We have several things here defined, but you'll notice again, the component is really simple. It's only just rendering. That's all it's doing. No logic is involved. We're creating an instance of sticky situation and just rolling with it. If time remaining is 0, we explode. But other than that, it's just doing this. So we have 3 things. We have agent, which is bond. We have remaining seconds, which you can see is counting down right there. We have mission start. And what we've done right here using that effect method I talked about, basically on mission start, it's like an effect. It's essentially going to run this function, and then the return is going to happen when it on mounts, right? Now, this is essentially a little ticker. As you can see, we get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it explodes, and the timer will turn off. So all this is well and good, but let's say that agent 1 can't do it. Well, if we tap another agent, you'll notice we're getting a new agent, and we're getting it asynchronously. Like we're actually hitting an API, and we're getting some random name, and it's working seamlessly. It's not this hyper complicated combination of hooks and use queries and set states and use reducers and state machines. It's just all right in front of you, and it's really tight and TypeScript safe. And what's really nice is it's portable, right? Because let's say I need to re-implement this. I needed to change the styles completely or change the language or add features, add glossarization and accessibility features. I don't have to think about the logic. The logic can just sit on the side, do what it's going to do, and I can just ignore it. And ultimately, this makes for a much better developer experience. You code faster, it's less complicated, and you have a good day. Finally, last example we're going to do is where this gets crazy. And this is my favorite feature of MVC by far. Now, we're only scratching the surface, but I want to tell you, this is, if you're not already sold, this is going to sell you context. So this is where things get really crazy. So essentially, context, big pain in the butt. Nobody likes it. Version 1 of context was a nightmare. The current implementation of concept, slightly less of a nightmare, but it's still a nightmare. What if you could just use context super straightforwardly, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a shared state. And basically, I'm going to just say state equals state.use. And I'm going to import this thing called provider. Now, this is not the React provider. This is the expressive provider. And it's just a normal component. It takes one prop. It's called of. And what is it going to do? It's going to take your state, and it's going to make it available to everything below it. And how do you access it, you might ask? Well, use this little method called get, which is the other static method on model. And Literally, this is one of two methods. These two methods give you all this power, and it's simplicity first. And I think you're going to really like it for that. So what we're going to do is take everything we've already learned and just apply it to this combined example, where we have about foo is over here and about bar is over here. We define these two components, and they basically both just do state.get. So they're basically sharing this instance of state. So this is useful if you're saying, I need a global state, I need a component specific state, I need a form, I need a model, I need a query, anything at any scale. It just works like this, and it's pretty straightforward. So in this case, what's nice about this right here, as we go into live example, is that if I edit a value from one, the other component sees it. So if I click on foo, you're going to notice that bar re-renders. Now remember, foo is not re-rendering because this combined component is this over here, but only bar re-renders when I click on foo, and only foo renders when I click on bar. Because again, this get, that's an intelligent hook that is able to detect exactly what I used in that context. It will only ever update for values that you actually see. And that's super useful because this is where that whole foo bar baz came in, where I was ignoring baz in the very first example. It's where you're sharing state because you're going to have a bunch of values that most components just don't care about. And so because you can subscribe to the specific values as needed, you can essentially make your life a lot easier. And I think that you can build some really fancy stuff with this. And while there's a lot more to see, trust me, this is enough that if this is all MVC offered, I think you would be able to cut a lot of fat out of your apps and make your apps easier to read, more portable, more documentable. Because here's the thing, if you are going to add docs to something, this is a fun too. And then you can see that in your IntelliSense, no matter where it's defined. I think that when you work on a team or you're sharing logic and you're trying to make your apps more concise and dry and more just efficient because they are like, only 10 kilobytes instead of, God knows how many hundred, I think that using React becomes a lot more pleasant. So that's the Cliff Notes, and that's the intro. And I'll give the floor back to Adrian so that we can begin Q&A.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Gabe. The great
You're very
presentation. So now we have some time for Q&A. So the first question I had was, are you using this in any of your own client projects currently?
I have, yes. I mean, that was kind of an uphill battle to say, oh, I made a library. Can we use that in prod? And they'd be like, yeah, maybe. Now with startups, it would be a lot easier than corporate. But I've worked for some fairly large companies that gave me some pushback on that. But where I have been able to use it, it's worked pretty well. But I can actually give you some reassurances here. So I have a little window right here in which I'm just going to go ahead and run Jest on this library. And just so you have some little extra confidence, this library is 100% covered by over 300 tests. As far as I'm concerned, this is pretty darn close to prod ready. We just got to get it basically stabilized, where right now we're on model version 0.18.1. Version 1 is coming super soon, like in a matter of days or weeks. And once that's live, I think that you can be very comfortable in your client project and you can get a lot done with it. And as documentation gets more robust and as we start to work on the site and all that sort of stuff, I think that you can feel very comfortable getting this into a prod project as a buy.
Well, awesome. I might try it.
Cool.
Okay, so we have another question from Lewis. If I get is from state.use, will my component re-render if any value of the state model updates, as opposed to only getting one attribute of the model?
This is such a good question. So is not only serves as a loopback, but also as an escape hatch. When you use is, it's important to note that is how do I put this? Like everybody here knows what object.create is, right? Like for those who don't know, it is basically you take an object and then object create takes the object that you just put in as the argument and creates a new object of which just inherits that object. This is what's happening with the proxy here. So it's essentially taking what is the true instance of state, and that is available on is, while what you're actually destructuring is a kind of like spy version. It's, like Takashi 69. It's going to just snitch in a little bit and tell the controller, hey, this is what I'm actually accessing. And so state is not strictly equal to what you're destructuring if you just do const state equals state.use. That is a really good question. Now, if you access stuff from state, you will be able to essentially kind of quietly access things. And so it will not re-render.
Cool.
But
Awesome.
at the same time, if you just said const state equals state.use, just traditionally, and then just use those values directly, then it will render because it will re-render because you didn't actually unwrap the subscriber yet. And so that's one way of doing it. And that is pretty easy. If you need kind of more like dynamic access that the subscriber will still respect, that's still possible.
Awesome. So we had another question from Lewis. Have you used it with Next.js, this library?
Well, so Next.js, I don't think would interfere with it. I have not personally, but the thing about Next.js is that it is more of a server than a front-end library. Like I know that there's some like hybridness to it. And I'll be honest, I haven't really tested whether or not the kind of more magical aspects of Nest.js would interfere with this. But if you're doing most normal things, yeah, you could use this with Nest.js pretty easily.
Okay. One last question. So what's the difference between get and use?
Okay, well, that's pretty easy to answer. You see, let's just hop over to context over here. So here is an example where we have two. State.use basically is creating that particular instance of state and then memoizing it, right? So when you use, you're saying, okay, I'm gonna make one of these things and then keep it, where state will only ever fetch it. And so if, for instance, I use state, but about foo wasn't wrapped in a provider, it would throw, right? Because it can't actually see or find for you an instance of state. So it's like, do I want to use in which I'm creating and using it, or do I want to fetch and use it? And that's the difference.
Okay, cool.
They still both subscribe. That's important to know. And then also, it's important to note that if the argument for either use or get is true, there's a flag that serves as a flag to put it into passive mode, in which it will just basically super lazily create your instance for you and not bother with all the subscription stuff. And then if you pass in false, then it will be optional. So it won't be required. It might be undefined, and you'll have to like actually assert that. So you do have a lot of options, because one of the ways that I got these methods to be so few, in fact, there's only basically 2 static methods worth noting, and about 5 properties on model. Really, models are designed to be just all up to you, what's in there. And they ship with as few methods and properties as possible. And the way I've made that work is basically leveraging overloads.
Okay, perfect. All right, before we wrap up, Gabe, did you have anything else to add? Last things?
Yes, I do. So for anybody watching who finds this really interesting and wants to learn more about this, you see, the docs are a living document right now. And I use this talk in particular to kind of put fire under my butt to get this stuff out there and start really caring about documentation. But it's still really young in that process. So it's not like you can just go to like expressive.com or whatever and then just get jumping right in, except for the things that I've demonstrated in these docs. So for anybody watching that really wants to like leverage this stuff and make use of it, reach out to me and I'll help you sort of figure out what you might not know, because Git issues are like what I'm going to be living by over the next couple of months as we get this thing ready for release and ultimately in use, where I'm starting to like fix problems. Just feedback, feedback, feedback. That's what I want from everybody watching. If you can use it and then you want to help, reach out to me. I could use as much perspective and feedback and constructive criticism as I can take, and it would be great to hear from you. And this is why I'm doing this talk, to sort of just get some early recruitment from fellow G2I members that are like, really smart, we're the best people, and get what I think are the best in practice opinions to kind of really make this work. So that is what I would say in closing. And if you want to help in PR and help docs, really totally welcome to do that. It would be the best thing ever. And, if you can see where this is headed and you can see the potential in this, then, maybe get involved in a really high level project that gets that on your resume. Ooh, I helped make Expressive when it destroyed the market and whatever. So that's what I think.
Okay, awesome. So that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Gabe. And it's been a pleasure hosting this event and hanging out with the G2I community. Thank you everyone for showing up.
Thank you.